The Intercooler Podcast is sponsored by JBR Capital, one of the UK's leading car finance specialists. Now, we only partner with like-minded organisations who really understand what it means to be a car enthusiast, and JBR Capital is a perfect fit for us. It's run by people who really love cars, and importantly, vehicle finance is all JBR Capital does. That alone is what the company exists to do. So whether you're looking to fund a classic, sports car, supercar or hypercar, see what JBR Capital can do for you. And it's not just about very high-end, expensive unobtainium. In fact, the minimum borrowing is £25,000 and the average £80,000. Head to JBR Capital on social media or jbrcapital.com online and tell them the Intercooler sent you. Right, let's get on with this week's podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast in 2022. And Happy New Year to all of you, and Happy New Year, Andrew.
Oh, hi, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, good. Do you know what? We were just talking before we came on, and it's enjoyable having some time off, particularly over Christmas when you just indulge. But it gets to this point in the year, and I just want to get back to work, and I want to get out of bed early, and I want to be productive and do stuff that's good for me.
I think that just shows how lucky we are, doesn't it? You know, because I'm sure there'll be an
True.
awful lot of people who, probably most people, who probably don't regard the return to work on January 4th as being anything other than something they absolutely have to do. But we've, we're good to go, aren't we? We've got, TI has a very interesting year ahead of it. And, you know, having really done very little for the thick end of a fortnight, other than eat and drink to excess, I'm just completely ready to go. So hopefully more than anything else, we'll have a lot of fun this year, and obviously we'll carry on with the Instagram stuff, and we'll continue to do this podcast, and who knows, maybe some other kinds of podcasts too. It's going to be a fun and interesting year, I think. I hope, anyway.
It will be, and I am now full-time on the Intercooler, so I'm not working for anybody else now. It's just TI, which is a significant step for me and for the business itself. It just means I can be fully focused on turning this thing of ours into the sort of, here we go, the multi-platform media brand that we want it to be. And there's an awful lot to do, but I just can't wait to get cracking with it all. So let's talk a little bit about how you and I spent the Christmas break. I'm talking cars, really. And I saw from your Twitter or your Instagram that even over Christmas, you were knocking about in your Caterham.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really planning on it. In fact, I was sort of feeling that I hadn't really driven very far, because if I had any long journeys to do, they would all be with family and that sort of thing, and you can't really be an idiot when you're doing that. And I was just sort of feeling the need to go and drive something silly. And I went to the shed fully intending to get the old Landy out, because you know what better in when stuck in the middle of nowhere at this time of year. And I just saw the Caterham there, and I just haven't driven it for a bit. It's the wrong, it's just not the sort of time of year in which a lot of people are out in that sort of thing. And I just thought Land Rover Caterham, Land Rover Caterham. And so I can't even remember. I think I did have some purpose. I can't remember what it was, why I took it out, or what I had to do, but I just had a hoot. It was just fun. And it's a different sort of fun, because everything's cold, everything's wet, so you're just skidding about all over the place. And and the remarkable thing about Caterham, I posted something on Instagram, and people were talking about, well, didn't you get covered in mud? And if you've got decent side screens, you don't at all. No. You need to kind of hose it off afterwards, because I don't really want to put a car caked in road grime back in the shed. But it was just kind of sort of life affirming. Decent heater, so you keep warm. Yeah. What else do you need? Just get out there. I'm not so precious about it that I'm worried about it getting a bit muddy or whatever, and it takes, if you hose it off immediately, it comes off pretty much as easily as it went on. And then you stick it back in your shed, and you've just had a completely different sort of motoring experience at a time of year that you wouldn't be expecting to do it. And it was good fun. It was good fun. In the meantime, I understand you've been having a rather different sort of sporting British car experience.
It's the other end of the spectrum, isn't it, really? So I've been knocking about for a couple of weeks in a Bentley Flying Spur. So big limousine saloon car, W12 engine. It must be 4 or 5 times the weight of your car, and probably 4 or 5 times the power as well.
So I would think, probably thick end of. I mean, my Caterham is it's a Crossflow car, which are very light. I would think it's about 500, maybe 520, and a Spur is what, 2.4, something like that.
Would have thought so, yeah. So it's
pretty
well
getting on for 5 times the weight.
Yeah, very different sort of car. And actually, after this, I'm going to take it for a bit of a spirited drive on some roads I know well. I didn't get to over Christmas because I always had my other half with me, and that is frowned upon. I will let you know.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Very much so.
Utterly frowned upon.
But
well, just basically not allowed.
It's not allowed. Yeah, you just don't dare, do you? And not necessarily my kind of car, but I just love it. When you're doing a long journey, I love a big luxury car with a long, long wheelbase, those air springs, and it's just quiet and serene, and you're just comfortable. And there's a lot to be said for that. But I'm going to head off this afternoon and drive this car, as I said, on some winding roads near to me. And I'm going to produce a video for the Instagram site because I want to know, does this thing actually handle? Maybe it's a bit of a inane question for a 2.5-ton limo, but I'm intrigued to know, does it handle? Because I suspect probably it's quite good. But I will report back on that later on.
I mean, they are pretty amazing, and just in terms of the sort of the bandwidth they can get into those cars now. What car manufacturers who know what they're doing can now do, particularly with dampers and air springs, the way that they can, and we've seen this, haven't we, with things like the Porsche Taycan, the way they can make cars that are really, really heavy still feel, if not agile, then certainly deft, I think is probably the word, and pleasant and consistent and accurate, and all those things that we look for in a car. I mean, it's never going to have an awful lot of steering feel. It's certainly you're not going to be sort of adjusting it on the throttle as you go through the corners. But given how comfortable, and I know Flying Spurs quite well, and given how well they ride, I suspect you're going to find it's terrific, given the kind of car that it is.
Of course. Good. Well, I mean, I
wouldn't swap it for the Caterham on that kind of road, but nevertheless.
Okay, well, we'll find out soon. Okay, well, actually, this week in the podcast, we're talking about the history and origins of sports car racing. Now, before we start, I don't think you need to be the sort of person who goes to Le Mans every year and spends the entire night throughout the race camped out at the Porsche curves. You don't need to be a Le Mans addict. I think we're going to tell you a few things you didn't know before, keep it lively, keep it interesting. Now, I suspect some of you listening are going to be new to the TI podcast. And so you might not be familiar with what it is that we do here. Really, it's just me and Andrew, a couple of car journalists with close to 50 years of experience between us in the industry. That's worrying, isn't it? Talking about cars.
Given that I'm probably contributing 35 of them, yes, it is quite.
It's not entirely equitable, let's say. We spend 40 minutes, 50 minutes each week talking about cars, talking about motorsport, hopefully in an interesting, well-informed, educational and I hope entertaining way. And if there's anything you think we should be talking about, then get in touch, because people often do, and we often pick up their subjects. The fact is, if we do, let's call it 50 of these a year, we need some ideas that haven't come from our own heads, don't we? So yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just often that, because, it's just you and me. And we're probably not as organized as people think they are, and that these podcasts are probably somewhat less planned than people may suspect they are. So, there will always be gaps, and people will sort of say, "Oh, why haven't you done a podcast on such and such?" And the reason is often not because we've decided not to, but because it's just kind of fallen down, the back of the sofa in our minds, and we just haven't done it. So, if there's something that and also, this what podcast number are we up to now? 90 something?
91.
91. Which means we started doing these nearly 2 years ago. And there may be all sorts of subjects which, there are other ways of revisiting, because, there is only a certain finite amount of stuff to talk about, but there is an infinite amount of ways in which you can talk about it. So, get in touch. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about, and we'll do that.
Excellent. Yeah, we will. Okay. The origins and the history of sports car racing. Let's keep it sort of general at the moment. What is the big appeal? What is the allure of sports car racing? What's the specific challenge? It's endurance, really, isn't it? That's the big one.
It's endurance, yeah. And I would just say now that we're talking about this now because I think, you and I have discussed in this podcast many times before the cyclical nature of sports car racing, how it never seems to find an equilibrium, does it? Where it's just kind of really
not
really
like
good,
F1 has,
like
where there's been one championship and you can trace it all the way back to 1950.
Yeah.
No.
And also in terms of its popularity, someone will come up with a new set of rules, and everyone will pile in, and it'll be really cool for a bit. And then usually what happens is somebody thinks of a really clever way of getting around whatever the fundamental rule is. And they often do that by just spending huge amounts of money, at which stage everybody else thinks, why bother? And everybody runs away from the sport. We saw this quite recently. And so they have to go back and they have to come up with a new set of rules, which we've also seen quite recently. And then the cycle kicks off again. And the reason that we are having this podcast today is we're kind of at the dawn of the new cycle, aren't we? So, we've got, Le Mans this year, but there is, there's Toyota and there is Peugeot and there's Glickenhaus and there's Alpine and they're competing in this new, I know it's technically around last year, but, this is the start of the new era of Le Mans hybrids. And then next year, there's the LMDH category coming in, which will have Porsche and Audi and Ferrari coming into LMH. So we appear, don't we, to be at the sort of start of one of those periods where the sport is in the ascendant. And so we just thought it would be quite nice to kick things off, as where everyone is starting to look forward to where it's going, to just have a quick look at where it's come from. And I think you're right. I think the appeal of it has always, but I think there have been two things actually. One is endurance, particularly when, and we're going to catch this very much in terms of Le Mans, because if we start talking about all the other series that are around the world, because sports car racing is a massive subject, isn't it? And there's been the ELMS and the LMS and there's IMSA and there's this, that, and the other. And so we're just going to keep this, quite general about sports car racing and probably predominantly about the most famous sports car race in the world, which is Le Mans, which started in 1923. And back then, W.O. Bentley, who had a car there, but it wasn't one of his, it was a private car. He was on record as saying, I think the whole thing's crazy. No one will finish. Cars aren't designed to race for 24 hours. And he simply couldn't, but he only went at the last minute because he felt guilty about, having one of his cars out there. And he caught the last minute boat. And by the end of it, he was totally captivated. He said, this is the most brilliant event I've ever seen. And he backed it from there on in. So it has a captivating quality to it. It doesn't tend to have that sort of wheel to wheel component that Formula One has when it's good, but it does have a heroic quality, doesn't it? Because in any, for instance, in any 24-hour race, you're going to get a bit of weather. You're certainly going to have a lot of stuff happening at nighttime. There's going to be a lot of attrition. There will be accidents, and so it has this totally different dimension. And also as a fan, as a spectator, it provides you something you can really get your teeth into. And also when it goes wrong, when the car that's been leading the race forever dies on the last lap, it provides a sporting spectacle and a range of emotion and everything else, which you just can't get in any other branch of the sport. So to me, that's to me, it has a heroic quality about it. Particularly, I guess, going back to the days when it was really a spectacularly unsafe sport to do. Spending an hour and a half or 2 hours in a Grand Prix car is one thing, but back in the days when only 2 drivers per car were doing it for 24 hours, come rain or shine, in flimsy little things, at places like Le Mans, which, even today, Le Mans would never get signed off as a Formula One track, would it? The safety standards are just a completely different level to what is required at the very highest level of motor racing. So, I think there's a sort of gladiatorial quality to it. There's a kind of intrepid nature to it, and also there's the other thing about these drivers having to work as a team with teammates. You also get, in my experience, just sports car drivers, they just seem to be nicer people than Formula One drivers, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because they have to work as a team. They have to get on with their teammates. They have to be thinking about the bloke back in the pits. They can't just strap themselves into the car and go, right, it's all down to me now. And so, that brings a different quality to it. So there are so many reasons, actually, thinking about it, why sports car racing, it may not be better or worse than Formula One, but it is definitely different. It's a different kind of appeal. And I've always found it, frankly, I probably find it more captivating than Formula One because I think it has yielded more good stories over the years.
Okay, let me put the opposing view then. I understand what you're saying. I don't think we're trying to find a winner between F1 and sports car racing, are we? They're just different branches of the same sport, and they each have to do their own thing. I find Formula One more thrilling because it's a shorter, sharper sprint race that I can watch it from start to finish, and really get a feel for the narrative of that race. I know that the cars are faster, and there is a sense that actually the world's best drivers are in Formula One, and maybe the world's best teams are operating there as well. So I'm actually more drawn to F1. However, there is something, I think intrepid and heroic is the word for endurance racing, particularly, they race through the night. Now, I actually don't know the answer to this, and maybe Corinne Chandok, our TI contributor, will know. But are they going slower at night just because visibility is less, or are they going the same speed?
No, they don't. There are endless examples of the fastest lap of the race being set in total darkness.
Because the air's cooler. And
because the air is cooler, they're often, by the time it gets dark, there are probably fewer cars out there, so there's less traffic. And so, so often the fastest lap of the race will come when it's coldest, which is often at like sort of 3-4 o'clock in the morning. And if you've been to the morning, you've seen how good modern headlights are. It's not like it's daylight for them, but they can spot an apex as well, in the dark as they can in the light. I mean, but that is another thing which I have always admired. I've done quite a few 24-hour races, very minor ones, but I've always been slower. So whether I'm quicker or slower, doesn't matter. But wherever I am relative to my teammates in the daylight, I'm always slower at night.
Interesting.
And I think it's because I've got an imagination. I can remember there's a wonderful bloke called Merrick Cox, who very sadly died recently. He was a complete lunatic. But years and years ago, we shared a Renault Clio Cup car, which we raced in Britcar. And around a UK circuit in daylight, you couldn't get a tag paper between our times. But if it was night or somewhere scary like the Nürburgring, he was just quicker than me. And I think those guys who are, the sort of the night masters, the people who actually say, give me the graveyard shift. I'll be in the car from 2 till 5 in the morning, and just absolutely loves that. I think those people are wonderful. And you are right about Formula One having the quicker drivers in them. There are any number of examples. Guys like Jackie Ickx, who is an absolute legend of sports car racing. He would say that when he went sports car racing in the mid-1970s, by that time he wasn't anymore the fastest bloke in Formula One, and he went to do it because it was an easier category in which to participate. Tom Christensen, I think he might have had a testing contract with a Formula One team at one stage. He's never started a Formula One race. He's won them all 9 times. I think there is something to be said for that. And that's why I said that, that they're not really better or worse than each other. They're not strictly comparable. Each will always have its fans. What I can tell you is that when I go to Le Mans and I'm at the Porsche curves at 4:30 in the morning, as the sun is coming up, watching these bruised and battered warriors still lapping the track at 150 mile an hour average, and I'm on my own, there's just nowhere in the world I'd rather be. I just find there's almost a romance about it. There is an absolute magical component to that kind of experience, which I haven't found in any other form of racing.
Unless the cars have diesel engines.
Unless the cars had diesel engines, we'll be getting onto those, won't we? I'm sure.
You have said on this podcast before that there was a moment when a diesel Audi farted past you and you just thought, I don't need this.
Well, at night, the problem with diesels was that at night, if you're standing there watching this, it's quite difficult to see the cars because the lights are so bright, they obscure what's behind them. But you could always hear, though, you could hear, sort of Jaguar V12 or, a Porsche Flat 6 or, Aston V8 thundering past. And so at least you knew what was coming, and it was great to listen to. And then the diesels turned up and they didn't even make any noise. So you just saw these lights go, and then they were gone. And, and it's the only time, well, until COVID struck, that I went for a period of time when I didn't go to Le Mans, because between when I started going to Le Mans, my first one was in 1988, until the diesels came, I'd gone to every one. And then I think it was 14, I started going again. And up until COVID, I went to, everyone after that. So, yeah.
Interesting. So one of the curious things about sports car racing, and I can only off the top of my head think of one other branch of motorsport for which this might be true. There is a single race that is actually bigger than the entire World Championship. Teams and drivers would rather win Le Mans than the World Endurance Championship, wouldn't they?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. 100%. What's the other one you're thinking about? Indy, yeah. Yeah.
That's probably fair, isn't
it? They would, and it's not healthy, because what you get, particularly when we have the dreaded balance of performance, is what we've seen in the past are teams so hell-bent on winning Le Mans is that they sacrifice the whole first part of the season to convince the authorities that they're slower than they actually are, so that they go to Le Mans with as an optimal a setup as possible. And then suddenly, bang, they're like 5 seconds a lap quicker than they've ever been anywhere. And people are going, well, what happened there? And then what you realize is you've been watching a pantomime, and you've actually been watching cars going around far slower than they're capable of, because they're all just, sandbagging furiously. And, we understand, don't we, that someone might want to sandbag in a practice session of a race, but not for the entire first part of the season, just because you're so desperate to win one race. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is, but, we have seen, haven't we, cars turn up at Le Mans and suddenly find a pace that they haven't had before, and either win their category or win the race. And it's always left a sort of slightly bad taste in the mouth. So, yeah, I don't know. The whole balance performance argument is, I think it's a necessary evil, because I think, without it, what you often get is, what we saw so often in the past is you just get periods of manufacturer domination, don't we? We remember from, what Audi did at the start of this century, what Porsche did in the 1980s, absolute domination. Seasons after seasons with barely anything else even getting a look in. And balance of performance does at least address that. So, yeah, I don't like it, but I think it's needed. But I think it should also be applied a lot more cleverly than has often been the case in the past. Okay,
well, let's rewind it then. You spoke about the very early days of Le Mans, 1923. When did it become a sort of global phenomenon? When was the first real golden era, do you think?
I think it so much depends on your perspective, doesn't it? Those early days, it absolutely wasn't a global phenomenon at all. The Bentley that was there in 1923, it was the only foreign car in the race. And it didn't win because the car wasn't sufficiently well prepared. And then the following year, I think there might have been a Belgian car in there, but it was. But by the end of the 30s, you had by the end of the 20s, sorry, you had some big players in there, guys like Chrysler in there, Stutz, which was massive at the time. Mercedes-Benz came in 1930 and had a really proper crack at it. So I think during the 20s, it went from being this sort of slightly curious, sport where people didn't even think that cars would survive. By the end of it, it was, and certainly right through the 30s, all the big names, Alfa Romeo, Bugatti, Aston Martin, Lagonda, all the French companies, Delage, Delay, they were all completely committed to it. So it was, certainly by the 1930s, it was a huge thing. Probably, as it is today, not as big as Grand Prix racing, but the very best people, works teams, guys like Tazio and Nuvolari, they all went and did it because it was an important thing to have been able to do. And then you kind of get to, well, the last one before the war was 1939, clearly. And then it was 10 years before they had another one. It came back in 1949. And, that was kind of very, very much it finding its feet. But I suppose it became a real prize, and something which people would, Jaguar in the 1950s, they built cars just to win them all. There was an entire championship to be done, which they weren't interested in at all, which is why if you look at what, we all think of, the Jaguar D-Type, what an amazing car. It won Le Mans 3 times on the trot. Well, go and see what else it won. Really very little. Very, very little.
Wow.
Because Le Mans was so important. So they designed these, these beautiful aerodynamic teardrops, which went down the Mulsanne straight like a bullet. But they never had much power. They didn't handle completely brilliantly compared to some of the other stuff. But they were just designed to win Le Mans, and nothing else mattered. And, to an extent, and certainly with some teams, that attitude sort of prevails a bit today. But yeah, certainly if we think of Le Mans in 1955, that terrible race where all those people died, all the big works teams were there. Works teams from Mercedes-Benz and from Ferrari and from Jaguar and from Aston Martin and from Porsche, and I go on and on and on. It was huge. It was absolutely massive, as big then undoubtedly as it is today.
Wow. Okay, so we'll keep going sort of chronologically, but I just want to scroll forward very briefly, because I first went to Le Mans in 2008 as a very green young car journalist. I was 21 in my first job, 6 months into my first job. And I sat down with Oliver Gavin, who until very recently was a Corvette factory racer, great guy.
Yeah.
And he told me that the race then was a 24-hour sprint. It's not that they weren't driving to conserve fuel or to protect the car or to look after tires or brake pads or whatever. They were going as fast as they could throughout. And he told me that actually it had been that way for quite a long time. So and have spoken to plenty of people who raced at Le Mans in the 50s. How close was it getting at that point to a sprint? Were we still a long way off?
Yeah, really quite a long way off. It's one of the reasons that Sterling never liked the race. Wow. He said it's not a race. Because he says if you're not racing, if you're not driving flat out all the time.
Interesting.
And so what they used to do, I'm just trying to think, specific instances, 1959, when Aston Martin won the race, and Sterling was one of their drivers, but he didn't win it because he'd been given a car. He'd been given a car with fewer main bearings than the others, which meant it had less internal friction, which meant it developed more power. But it was less likely to last. And he was basically told to go out there and break the Ferraris, who were the big opposition. And that's what he did. He just went off like a lunatic. And Ferrari started falling by the wayside. Inevitably, his car broke. And Carroll Shelby and Roy Salvadori swept through to win the race. And so that's what you did. If you wanted to drive flat out, you did it strategically to break the opposition, but you never did it in the hope that you would, with a realistic hope that you'd finish the race, because you just wouldn't. Because if you treated the car like that for that period of time, well, it wouldn't put up with it. And that was still the case right through the 60s into the 70s. I think it was probably, I suspect if you talk to guys like Jackie Ickx and Derek Bell when they were driving in the late 70s and the early 80s Porsches, I would think they would probably say, no, we could probably go pretty bloody quick, but that was because Porsche were engineering their cars, frankly, to a different standard to anybody else. And they had synchromesh gearboxes, so they were much more difficult to break. But I think really, I would say it first became a 24-hour sprint, probably sometime in the late 1990s, when the sort of BPR stopped and prototypes started coming back. And you started getting cars like Audi R8s. The Audi R8 first competed at Le Mans in 1999. And I don't think that anybody driving that was holding back. I'm sure they would have gone absolutely flat strap from start to finish. So I think that's probably when, there was literally, and the idea was, if you couldn't build a car that would survive being driven like that for 24 hours and it broke, that wasn't the driver's fault for breaking the car. That was your fault for not building a car that was strong enough. And that's the way it has been ever since. And the only reason that they're quicker in qualifying now than they are in the race is obviously the tires are different, the fuel loads are different, and I suspect drivers are prepared to take more risks in quali with traffic than they are in the race. And also, I suppose drivers, if you're doing a qualifying like that, you can probably take your brain out for one lap. But even the best modern drivers, I can't believe that they can do, a triple stint at quali pace. Mentally, I just don't think they can do that. But certainly they drive the cars as fast as they can during the race, and they don't think about curbs. And they don't think about preserving transmissions, and they don't think about, we better, we're leading the race by, 3 laps. Let's use fewer revs and that sort of thing, which they were always thinking about back in the day, and worrying about, how long the brakes are going to last, whether the clutch is going to give out. Back then, drivers were chosen to race at Le Mans because they were known to be sympathetic to cars. Because if you didn't, when Richard Attwood won Le Mans for Porsche in 1970, and he could choose his driver, he chose Hans Hermann to be his co-driver, not because Hans was the fastest driver out there. He was anything but frankly, he was right at the end of his career. He retired at the end of the race. He was, by the standards of some of the other maniacs who are out there, the Joe Sifferts and the Pedro Rodriguez and the Vic Elfords of this world, Hans Hermann was a plodder, but he was a reliable plodder. And he got the thing round and he looked after it and they won the race. And that's what you had to do back then. It's just not like that now.
Yeah, so even in the 1970s, it was like that. If you could choose any era to be camped at your favorite spot at the Porsche curves at 4:30 a.m., when would it be?
I've often thought about this. One I saw, which was Group C when it was at its peak in the late 1980s. And that was, when you had all those cars from all those manufacturers, you had, I won't remember them all, but Porsche and Toyota and Aston Martin and Jaguar and Mercedes and Nissan and all and Mazdas, and you had screaming V12s and shrieking rotaries and thundering V8s and rumbling flat sixes and all these cars, going really, really fast because they had full ground effect bodywork. That was spectacular. So I felt very privileged to have seen that. I actually think more recently, when we had those couple of years when the hybrids were closely matched, so you had the Toyotas and the Porsches and the Audis. And you had all those different configurations. You had, 4-cylinder engines, 6-cylinder engines, 8-cylinder engines. You had hybrids with supercapacitors and with flywheels and with batteries. And you had cars with rear-wheel drive. And you had cars with 4-wheel drive. And you had cars which were petrol. And you had cars with diesel. And you stick them all that, and they're still within like 0.3 of each other.
Amazing.
I just thought that was simply astonishing. I thought that was absolutely incredible. But I guess, and this isn't going to surprise anybody. I guess if there was an era, it would have to have been the early 70s. For want of a better phrase, the sort of Steve McQueen Le Mans, Porsche 917, because that's when it was. I think that's when the jeopardy was the highest. I think it's when the cars were the most beautiful. I think it's probably when they sounded the best. I think it's when the drivers were the most heroic. And it's like, I guess it would have been like going to the Isle of Man TT. When you do that and you see drivers coming out of their little awnings to go and get their bikes, you don't really see someone about to go and do a race. It's almost like watching someone go into battle.
Yeah.
And they have that look about them, and there is that sort of gladiatorial quality which we talked about. And I wasn't around at the time. I was sort of 5-6 years old, but to have been there, to have seen that, I suspect that sitting here imagining what it must have been like, the reality might have been really quite different, because let's not forget, this was an era where Porsche was totally dominant. They in 1970, 1971, which are the specific areas I'm talking about, they won almost everything. Alfa Romeo, Ferrari won 1 race. Alfa Romeo might have won 2. The 917s won everything else. So you're not talking about, well, there were amazing tussles, but they were between Porsches. where maybe it was the John Wyer cars up against the Martini cars or the Salzburg cars or whatever, but it was, it was very rarely Porsche versus Ferrari wheel to wheel because the Porsches were gone. So maybe there's a slightly rose-tinted element to what I'm saying, and maybe if you were actually there and you're standing there, you'd be thinking, I can remember, in the 1980s, before I started to go to Le Mans, but from 1981 to 1987, so that's 7 races on a trot, Porsche won every single race, and just thinking, oh, for goodness sake. And that's, I think that's why, when I did go 1988 and a Jaguar won it, I mean, obviously there was a certain amount of pride in, in a British car doing it, and a car that was so beautiful and sounded so great. But, I'm afraid it's an awful thing to say, and no one it admires Porsche more than me. But a lot of the joy was it wasn't the Porsche that was winning, because they just won so much for so long. And so those periods of extreme dominance, just like in Formula One, just like we've had recently. And again, one of the reasons that, I had no problems at all with, Max becoming, the champion last year, as is, was, the relief that it wasn't another bloody Mercedes. And I mean, Mercedes, no ill in saying it. It's just, it's just nice to have a change, isn't it? I think it's good for the sport to have a change. And that's why, I think balance of performance is probably quite important.
You might have triggered a few people with saying that those comments about Max and his first championship. If you want to know exactly how we really feel about that whole situation, we did an entire podcast about the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, the day after the race. So scroll back through the podcast archive, you'll find it, and we talk about it in depth. It's an interesting, actually a really exciting January for motorsport, because we've got entirely new regulations for Formula One, and we hope round 2 of that epic title fight between Max and Lewis. We've got entirely new regulations in the World Rally Championship, and we've got, so we know the hypercar sports car regs actually came in last year, but they come in sort of more fully this year. We've got more competition in the hypercar class at Le Mans this year. It's just, there's so much to look forward to about motorsport in 2022 and beyond. I think we're going to track it quite closely, aren't we, throughout the year?
I think we are, because, I mean, I don't know whether it's a great thing, but the interesting thing, whenever you get a new set of regulations, is things are never quite what you expect. And sometimes, you do get close competitions, but sometimes you just suddenly discover that someone's done their homework better than anybody else, and then you can have a situation where for the whole of the duration of that particular set of regulations, everybody else is just trying to play catch up. So I really, really hope that that all those forms of motorsport are as exciting as we hope they're going to be. We're certainly going to be very, very close to it. We're certainly going to be keeping an amazingly close eye on everything that goes on. But I just wonder whether it will be quite. I mean, I don't know whether there might be a certain sense of anticlimax to some of it, but who knows?
I think it's almost inevitable, isn't it? Another thing that I just want to mention while we're on the form of motorsport and things changing in 22 is yesterday. ProDrive with its Hunter competition car, Dakar car, ProDrive won its first Dakar stage, and it was also the first Dakar stage win for a car powered by a sustainable plant-based fuel. So the ProDrive Hunters run on ProDrive Eco Power, which is made from agricultural waste, which is an important point. So it's not just a sustainable fuel, but I haven't looked into it fully, but on that basis, it seems like a sustainable fuel that isn't coming from crops that might otherwise be used to feed people, which is a big issue with biofuels. And according to ProDrive, that fuel reduces CO2 emissions by 80%. So on the stage that car won, 3 tons of carbon dioxide were saved. 3 tons.
By one car.
And one car. And ProDrive have also said that as long as your car runs a modern petrol engine, that fuel will go straight in and it will run very happily on it. There needs to be a very mature and grown up conversation around all of these alternative fuels, because there'll be pros and cons and all sorts. But I thought that was a really interesting moment in time, and hopefully it will have a positive impact on other forms of motorsport, and perhaps for road cars as well.
And it may yet prolong the period of time that internal combustion engines, which we all love, can stay relevant in motorsport, and maybe in time, that'll be long enough for people to find ways to get clean, green, environmentally friendly fuels into internal combustion engines. I suspect that almost everything we drive going through in the future will be electric, but maybe there will just be some that aren't. Just
to wrap things up on sports car racing then, who are, in your view, the sort of standout drivers from across the ages? We've already mentioned Tom Christensen, who is the record holder for Le Mans wins, 9 Le Mans wins, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Who else comes to mind?
Okay, so starting at the very beginning, Wolf Bonato, the chairman of Bentley, his Le Mans record is unequaled in one sense. I don't think anybody ever will equal it, because he only did it 3 times and he won all 3 of them. So he has a back-to-back hat trick between 1928 and 1930, played 3, won 3. So, I definitely take my hat off to him. Other than that, guys like, Derek Bell, just fantastic, because the thing about Derek was, he was he first raced at Le Mans in 1970, I think, for Ferrari, sharing with Ronnie Peterson. Car didn't last long because there was a massive accident, which took out a lot of cars, and his being one of them. But he was also, I think he was on the podium at Le Mans 25 years later. Sharing the Harris McLaren. And frankly, but for a clutch issue, they'd have won that race. And he was there with his son on the podium in the 190. So I think that's 25 years, during the course of which he also managed to win the race outright 5 times. Jackie Hicks goes without saying, 6 times winner. And yeah, there have been so many, haven't there, over the years. And it's just interesting that they are, there are obviously any number of Formula One drivers who've gone on to win Le Mans. But just trying to think of Formula One drivers who've won the World Championship and then gone on to win Le Mans. There are some of them, Graham Hill among them. But
Fernando.
I think it's just, Fernando. I think it is just a different discipline, and requiring a different skill set, as I said at the beginning of this. I don't think just because you're a whiz in a Formula One car is any guarantee that you're going to, sweep all before you in a sports car. It's another reason I love it all so much. So yeah, so here's to a really cracking season. I suspect the Le Mans to go to is going to be next year. Le Mans 2023 will be the year. Ferrari back at Le Mans. Just think what that's going to be like. Can you imagine what the gate's going to be like? Huge. Just how many the Tifosi turn up at Le Mans is going to be, Ferrari versus Porsche versus Audi versus Toyota, and everybody else in there. It's going to be absolute. So this year I think will be good. I think it'll be interesting. But next year I think it's going to be absolutely epic. I think it is going to be one of the seasons of all time. And it will also be, and this probably isn't a coincidence knowing the ACO, the 100th anniversary of law. So let's have lots of fun this year, but always with a mind to next year being the one where it really kicks off properly.
Yeah, and we'll have to make sure we're there, definitely. Good. Okay, well, we'll leave that one there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to JBR Capital for sponsoring the podcast. And if you'd like to do us a favor, and I hope you will, please rate and review the podcast. That's how, it's really one of the main mechanisms we have for finding a new audience and making the podcast bigger and better. So please do rate and review and subscribe to the podcast wherever you can. And as ever, we'll be back to talk to you all again next week.
All the best.